So this all happened to my best friend back when she was like 15, way back in the mid-2000s. We live in rural Alabama, like right out in the middle of the sticks, and one Friday night, her dad gets a hankering for a basket of Royal Reds. They want to head out, but they also couldn't get a sitter at such a short notice. This suited my BFF, who was saying how she didn't need a babysitter, that she was basically a grown-up and could be trusted to be left home alone for the night. Her parents agree, but tell her she better be in bed and asleep by the time they get home, which would be sometime after 11 p.m. If she wasn't, she'd be grounded, but if she was, her mom told her that she'd take her shopping the next day. Pretty sweet deal, right? Home alone and a shopping spree. I'm swooning just thinking about it. Anyway, it comes the night of her parents' little dinner date. They give her some money for pizza, and she basically has the time of her life, watching whatever she wanted on the TV, pigging out on pizza and ice cream. She had the entire place to herself. All she had to do was be in bed by like 11:15, and she'd have herself half a whole new wardrobe. So the time comes, and she has the whole kitchen clean and tidy. Ice cream away, pizza boxes chucked in the trash, and she's all up in her PJs, mission accomplished. Then out of nowhere, she hears the front door to her home open and close, and footsteps down in the hallway. So she jumps into bed, turns off the lights, then lies in bed with her back to the bedroom door and pretends to be asleep. Sure enough, she hears her parents climbing the stairs quietly, shushing each other and giggling as they went. Obviously, they've been a little too liberal with their drinks, and in hindsight, maybe that's why they wanted her to be in bed by the time they came home, so she wouldn't be able to poke fun at them for being drunk. Anyway, she's still lying there, not making a sound, when she hears the handle of her bedroom door begin to turn. They're obviously checking to see if she's actually asleep, so she lies real still and doesn't make a sound. Then whoever it was who opened the door, either her mom or dad, they start creeping across the carpet towards her. Then when they reach her bedside, they lean over, stroke her hair a little, then give her a kiss on the side of the head. That confirmed that they had been drinking because all she could smell was booze as whoever it was crept out of the room, and then there was silence again. Mom and Dad must have just gone right to bed to sleep off their margaritas because she barely heard a thing after that. Maybe some stumbling to and from the bathroom, but apart from that, silence. She's actually kind of sleepy by that point, so she just lays there, drifts off, then wakes up bright and early the next morning, ready for her shopping trip reward. She rolls over, checks her phone, only to discover she has a bunch of texts from her mom, all timed for an hour or so after she'd fallen asleep. She opens them, half expecting a bunch of "You're an amazing daughter, I love you, XOXO" drunk texts, but in her half-asleep haze, what she reads makes no sense to her whatsoever. The message read something like, "Honey, I'm sorry if we worried you, but we saw Aunt Barb and her new boyfriend and we totally lost track of time. We're staying in a motel tonight, but we'll be back tomorrow around 12, promise. Then we can go to that shopping trip." I can only imagine what that must have been like at the time, but my friend said the information was a square peg and her brain was a round hole. It just wouldn't fit. Her parents had come all the way home, then gone back out again. But why? She texts her mom like, "Did you come home last night?" And as she does, she said she felt her heart begin to pound in her chest. Because if she said no, she was either lying or it wasn't either of her parents in the house the night before. It was a complete stranger. As soon as that horrible penny really dropped for her, she called her mom in a panic, who obviously then told her to call the cops ASAP. But when they got there was nothing to tell them how this stranger had gotten in, if anything was taken, or how they gotten out. My friend swears that she'd heard the front door close quietly, but if that was the case, how did the guy get a copy of the front door key? Even scarier is their security cameras didn't record anyone walking up their driveway, and there's literally no other way to get to the front of the property without being caught on it. It 100% wasn't some kind of dream either, because someone had evidently, and very quietly, gone through her mom's clothes at some point during the night. No one was ever caught over it. The cops didn't even have a suspect, and I don't believe my friend would just make something up like that. Like she was really actually upset about it for a really long time, and unless the whole thing is an elaborate cover story for something else, then it really did happen. It just freaks me out thinking the guy is still out there, and that he's that good at being a freaking creep, that he can do all that stuff and stay totally undetected. Just the thought of it makes my skin crawl. I used to work in a funeral home here in Alabama. Nothing too morbid, don't worry. I mostly worked in the office, so it wasn't nearly as creepy or spooky as you might imagine. But by pure happenstance, I have a pretty horrifying story to tell from my time working there, and it involved a guy whose wife and baby daughter had been murdered in shocking and mysterious circumstances. And we had to find out from the freaking news, too. A person called, I'm assuming the guy's relative, and made the funeral arrangements, and as usual, we took down the names of the deceased so we could get the orders of service designed and printed out. Then a few days later, one of the coworkers sends me a link to some local news website saying like, "Holy crap, we're doing the funeral." The article was all about how someone broke into the guy's house while he was at work, all just to shoot his wife and kid before leaving. The scary thing was, the guy's business partner had the exact same thing happen to his family like 6 months ago, and the article read like someone wanted revenge on the two business partners because of some deal gone wrong or whatever. There was a good chance the same person or people had killed both families. But after the first murders, the cops had been stumped for a suspect. They'd done pretty much the same thing, gone in totally quiet, no witnesses, killed the family, then cleaned up after themselves to erase any potential evidence. Only for the second set of murders, the killer had messed up. Someone saw the guy's face as he fled across a field to the rear of the guy's house, and it seemed like the cops were closing in on their shooter. Anyway, the funeral comes and goes, and it was honestly one of the most heartbreaking I'd ever worked. The tiny little coffin we had for the baby daughter was honestly too much to look at, and even after many deeply moving services, I thought I was desensitized to all that. But no. One look at that little coffin, and I felt a huge lump in my throat. The husband was just distraught too. Like a lot of people were weirdly stoic during the funerals of their loved ones, even when they're lost in sudden tragedies. But this guy was just in pieces. Like it was legitimately difficult to watch at times. The worst was when he tried to get up to give a little eulogy for his wife and kid. He tried so hard to get the words out, but in the end, I think it was his brother that came up just to lead him away when he broke down completely. We all agreed it was one of the toughest funerals we had ever had to host, but the story didn't end there, and it actually turned out to be one of the most horrible things that I'd ever heard of, let alone been a part of. A few weeks after the funeral, my coworkers sent me another news link. Only this one doesn't have a message with it. Just that blue and yellow horrified face emoji. When I opened the page, I discovered that the cops had actually caught the guy who'd killed our customer's wife and child, and my jaw was on the floor as I read that the murder was actually the guy's business partner. You know, the same guy whose family had been killed in almost the exact same way. That guy. The article didn't say much other than that, so we had to keep checking the news and stuff to find out any more info. But then get this. The murderer gets a lesser charge for cooperating with the police, and part of that cooperation was showing them the text between him and his business partner, where they're arranging to kill each other's families so they could run off with their side girls, one of which was actually a secretary at the company they owned and operated. I think the most messed up thing was how you never would have guessed the guy was capable of anything like that. I mean, I suppose he wasn't. Neither of them was. That's why they arranged to kill each other's families instead of just doing it themselves. Maybe that's why he was so devastated at the funeral. It all just kind of hit him, and he realized that no matter how much he tried to distance himself, he was responsible for their deaths. Not only that, but he'd already killed a woman and 2 little boys himself. Just thinking about it, is enough to make my brain boil. I just don't understand how they each came to such a truly monstrous decision. And honestly, I think it really changed how I look at the world. I looked at the guy at the funeral. I stood next to him for a good portion of it, and he seemed truly heartbroken. And you got this impression that he was the most loving, caring father in the world. But now, he's on death row, making appeal after appeal because he not only had the evil in him to kill two innocent children, as well as their mother, who begged for their lives before he shot her, but he also had it in him to basically kill his own, too. My dad grew up in Alabama, and by his own admission, he was a dumb redneck who was a pain in the butt for everyone that knew him, except of course for his little posse of booze-hound redneck buddies. One of their favorite things to do was drive around in a truck one of them owned, passing around a bottle of hooch they'd each take huge pulls from, including the driver. Then, once they were nice and toasty, they'd go tearing it around the back roads where they lived, going 50 or 60 miles an hour down these blind bends and whatnot. He says there was this one time where the driver was way too drunk and almost crashed like twice before he asked the guy to let him out. He says he just had this bad feeling that something bad was going to happen, and since they wouldn't chill out or slow down, he just thought, alright, I'ma head out. So my dad gets out and starts walking, or maybe more like stumbling back the opposite way in the direction of town. Minutes later, he hears this huge metallic boom echoing through the trees behind him, and he just knows it was the sound of his buddies having just crashed. Turns out they were less than a mile down the road when they hit this really sharp turn. The driver just didn't react in time, and they plowed into a tree doing a buck and change. Two of them died on impact, and the only reason the guy in the back seat survived was because they just so happened to crash in an area that was basically the extended backyard of this married couple of doctors. He still lost an arm, part of his foot, and was in the hospital for the rest of the year, but yeah, he made it though. My dad told me this story on the day I asked him about getting my driver's permit, probably as a way of scaring me out of drunk driving. And boy did it work. Because thinking like if he didn't get out of the car, I wouldn't exist. That really freaked me out when I thought about it. I was born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida area, but for college, I went to Auburn in Alabama. It was a pretty great place to go to school, and I still got a whole lot of love for Bama, but once I graduated, I went right back home to Jacksonville to start my career. But that meant that every year or so I'd fly back to Auburn to hook up with my old college buddies for some heavy reminiscing and some equally heavy drinking. So this is back in 2007, but I flew out of there to spend a weekend with the old frat boys, and while we're out drinking, one of them pulls out a pack of cigarettes. I hadn't smoked for years by that point, as my ex-girlfriend had hated it, but since she was my ex by that time, I thought, why not? What harm can it do? So we head out, bum a smoke, then feel that sweet nicotine reintroducing itself to my central nervous system, all the while we get all nostalgic about our college days. Then, as we're standing there, some car just goes zooming past the bar, totally ignoring a red light before driving up this gentle curving hill. All we could do was watch in horror as it veered over the double yellow before absolutely smashing into a car coming in the other direction. The impact sounded like a bomb went off, and both cars' butt ends were thrown into the air before they landed with a smash. Then, the engine block of the oncoming car just starts smoking, before we started seeing flames flicking up through the gaps in the hood. And that's when the adrenaline kicked in. With me and my buddy just bolting back into the bar, grabbing a fire extinguisher and screaming at the bartender to call 911. So, there's me, my college buddy, and a few others of the bar's customers running over to the accident. I try spraying the fire in the engine block, but I don't think it was the right kind of extinguisher for a fuel fire because I just about emptied that thing all over it and it barely made a dent. In the end, The heat and fumes were so intense that we all just had to back off. I mean, people were gasping for air after taking a lung full of smoke, and besides, the fire was just totally out of control. The thing was, we'd been completely unable to rescue the driver of the oncoming vehicle. The driver off the speeding car was just a mess, and I kind of figured that there was no saving them. No seatbelt. There wasn't. But the woman in the oncoming vehicle was trapped, and as much as we all tried, we couldn't get her free before the flames took hold. We had to listen to that woman burning to death, and let me tell you, it's a million times worse than you can possibly imagine. All those death scenes in movies, they're really just acting. You can't ever get that tone or pitch to a death scream unless a person is actually dying. And I learned that on that night in Bama. The fire department got out to us pretty fast, but it was too late. Then the cops walked some of us back to the bar to take statements. My buddy kept me up to date with the case after I flew back to Florida, and I'm sorry to say, it didn't stop being messed up. So the woman who died was only like a block away from her house, and she was a new mom, while the speeder was some drunk, stupid trust fund kid. Only, remember how I said the kid looked deader than a West Texas salad bar? He actually survived. He lost a leg or an arm, I think, but yeah, he got to carry on living when he had absolutely no right to. Years ago now, my cousin was going to school in Tuscaloosa and was living in a small off-campus apartment on her lonesome. One night, she's in her bedroom studying with no company except a cat that she had recently adopted. I say recently, and I mean recently because she said she'd literally only signed the papers maybe a week before, and she still wasn't even 100% sure on what she was going to name her yet. Anyway, she's sitting there, working through whatever she was studying when the cat starts acting all crazy and stuff. She's pacing the floor, yowling constantly, then occasionally hissing at the bedroom door. My cousin keeps telling her to chill, giving her treats and pets, and just assuming the whole thing is just all part of the cat getting used to her new home. In the end, she kind of gave up and opened up her bedroom door so the cat could explore the rest of the apartment. But the cat goes right to the front door of the apartment, stops yowling, but just sits there, staring at the front door. My cousin said she was all like, "What?" But then gets this strong, sudden urge to check the peephole on her apartment door, just in case there was anyone standing outside. Funnily enough, there was. The cat must have been picking up their scent or whatever the whole time, and was just so anxious to be in a new place that she was freaking out. But then, as my cousin is looking at the guy, trying to work out if she recognizes him or not, the peepholes kind of distort people's faces. The guy pulls something out of his jacket and slides it over his head. A ski mask. Then he knocks on the door. She said her heart was just about jumping out of her chest by that point, and after she started threading all the chain locks, she ran back to her room to grab her phone for a 911 call. She gives them a description. The cops pick the guy up and find the ski mask on him, and when they arrest and take a DNA sample from the guy, they discover he's a serial attacker, responsible for multiple different unsolved attacks over the previous 2 years. If it wasn't for her cat freaking out, she never would have seen his face, and she might not have scared him away by locking the door properly. So really, if you think about it, that new cat saved her life. If she had wasted time over the decision, if she had waited a week, she might not even be alive or in any fit state to give some sweet little kitty a new home. But boy, is she glad she did. She and I both. I'm an ophthalmologist. That's a fancy pants speak for eye doctor, by the way, here in Alabama. And because we have a heck of a lot of agricultural workers in my district, I get an awful lot of quite weird and wonderful medical issues to diagnose and deal with. One day, a polite young man with an infected eyelid comes into my office, and he's been having a miserable time. He'd been to see another eye doctor who put him on a course of antibiotics, but other than bring down the swelling a little, it didn't get rid of the infection entirely. Obviously, I'm very intrigued by this because an antibiotic resistance is a very serious and potentially deadly problem that we're inevitably going to face in the future. So, initially I asked the young man to tell me exactly what happened to him in the days leading up to the infection, as well as hitting him with a bunch of questions regarding his previous treatments. I'm ready to get all house MD to diagnose the undiagnosable, so to speak, but when I asked the guy if his previous doctor had conducted a physical examination of his eyelid, he told me, not really. I asked him for a clearer answer, and the patient elaborated that, to quote, "That old sawbun's done plenty of poking and prodding, but then he just give me some pills and kick me out of his office." Sounded like pure embellishment on his part, as I know all too well that unsatisfied patients can needlessly call your qualifications into question. But still, I entertained him, gave him a local anesthetic and numb his eyelid, then did the old flippy inside out to get a look at the interior. The more squeamish among you are going to wish for a TLDR, but I'm afraid there's simply no easy way to say this. There appeared to be a visible abscess inside the tissue, surrounded by a thick material of viscous fluid. I thought I'd give it a nudge, and what do you know? It moves. This wasn't an abscess or anything resulting from an infection. It was something else entirely, and it was only when I managed to remove it in one whole piece that I realized what I was looking at. It was a fly larva. This tied into the part of the patient's story where he told me that he'd had a bug bite her in the eye a few days before this mysterious infection began. Not just bit her either. It had been stuck on his eyeball for a millisecond before he'd managed to bat it away. But when I asked him if he'd bothered to wash his eye afterward, he said no. That if a worker ran off to wash their face every time a bug flew into him, that nothing would ever get done. Makes sense, I suppose, but please, folks, cleanliness is next to godliness in so many ways. On the morning of January 17th, 1997, the staff of Atlanta North Side Family Planning Services in the suburb of Sandy Springs were just beginning their day. It was around 9:30 a.m. on a Friday, and although wary from the busy working week, the staff were looking forward to the well-deserved weekend ahead. The clinic itself was set into a large multi-story office complex that housed a number of other professionals such as doctors, dentists, and lawyers. But one particular employee of the family planning clinic wasn't exactly having the best of mornings. Geraldine Thompson, a then 23-year-old counselor at the clinic, was running late. Not only had she failed to wake up for her alarm, but getting caught in the rush hour traffic meant she was uncharacteristically tardy. Yet little did Geraldine know, but a busted alarm clock and bad traffic would be the very least of her troubles that morning. Because as she parked her car up and approached the office building, a huge explosion tore through the building, sending glass and debris flying through the air. The explosion brought down parts of walls and ceilings and caused a small fire in the large 3-story building. Thankfully, it was a fire that was quickly extinguished thanks to the swift and courageous response of the Atlanta Fire Department. And once the area was secure, investigators from a number of different agencies began to comb through the wreckage in an attempt to determine the source of the blast. About an hour after the blast, cops and firefighters were still in the process of assessing damage, determining the source and ensuring that the area around the building was clear of civilians. Then, out of nowhere, a second explosion ripped through the gathered crowd, sending scores of people flying through the air and causing horrendous wounds to several of them. Only then was it obvious what was going on. It was a terrorist attack. It almost seemed timed to hurt those coming to the scene to help, Atlanta Mayor Bill Campbell later said. And he was right, because what happened is known as a double tap, a bombing technique in which the attacker first draws attention to an area, ensuring a gathered crowd, before a second device is detonated, one designed purely to kill first responders and innocent bystanders. One police investigator is said to have taken a fist-sized chunk of shrapnel, while the cameraman of an attending news crew suffered a fractured skull, landing on his head after the force of the explosion threw him into the air. Hospitals treated and released most of the injured by the afternoon, including 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, an agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, and a Fulton County firefighter. But miraculously, despite the plethora of injuries and psychological trauma, not a single person lost their life that day. "My guardian angel made me sleep late today," Geraldine Thompson later said in a statement to the media, and even the most hardened skeptics are forced to admit that it makes for one heck of a coincidence. But who in their right minds would target a doctor's office with a dual bomb attack? Many believe the answer was to be found in another bomb attack, one that had occurred the previous summer at the Centennial Olympic Park. This is the very same bombing federal investigators initially blamed on Richard Jewell, a security guard who was later exonerated, and at the time of the second blast, the culprit had yet to be identified. Yet despite the Atlanta PD's failure to find their bomber, United States Attorney Kent Alexander assured the public that justice would be swift. "This is probably about the worst place in the country to set off a bomb," he said, referring to the expertise, the experience the APD had picked up over the previous year. "We are ready to pursue this professionally and expertly." Kent Alexander wasn't bluffing. The FBI had already drawn up a psychological profile of the perpetrator based on the method, timing, and placement of the bomb. The method showed that this man was dangerously intelligent and diligent when it came to bomb making and the placement of such devices. He had evidently studied the techniques of previous terror organizations, particularly on how to cause mass casualties through a protracted bombing campaign. The timing, January 17th, was only a few days away from the 24th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion. So when police connected this to the location of the bombing, the kind of person they were dealing with became terrifyingly clear. The bombing today was one more piece of evidence in a trail of violence leading up to the anniversary, said the Director of Child Defense and Research at the Planned Parenthood Federation of America in a later statement to the media. Then there's the type of attack it was. Simply horrifying, Ann Glazier continued. First the bombing of the clinic, and then the follow-up in the dumpster nearby, which would be the normal path for people to come to help, to investigate, really marks this as the terrorist act that it is. It's designed to instill fear in the community. Americans of all religions, creeds, and political leanings joined in condemning the attack as a cynical and abhorrent act of mass murder. One Atlanta pastor was quoted as saying, "I got my opinions on abortion too, we all do. But to take the love of the innocent like that, it's just awful." But others, like Paul de Paris, editor-in-chief of Life Advocate magazine, was quoted as saying, "I think it is wonderful any time an abortion clinic is closed for whatever reason. If the toilet backs up and closes the place, that is great. I think it is great when babies' lives are saved through whatever means. I'm not going to try to condemn somebody that God won't condemn." Perry was widely condemned for that statement, and was swiftly reminded by many of his peers that the Bible makes it clear that the murder of innocent people is a deadly sin. If the bomber's intentions weren't clear from the bombing of the Planned Parenthood clinic, the bombing of the Other Side Lounge made them chillingly clear. First opened in 1990 on Piedmont Road, the Other Side was one of the most prominent lesbian bars in all of Atlanta. It had a large dance floor, pool tables, smaller, quieter areas, and a fully stocked bar. But the Other Side was so much more than just a place to hang out and drink cocktails, and other than provide a place for like-minded individuals to meet and hook up, it also provided something of a safe haven for members of the LGBTQ+ community that had been thrown out or disowned entirely by intolerant family members. Co-owners Beverly McMahon and Dana Ford kept the nightclub open on all public and religious holidays, ensuring people had a place to go, and it became a home away from home for those without a welcoming place to go. So on the night of February 21st, 1997, when 2 bombs exploded at the bar, injuring 5 of the patrons, it became clear that a vicious and bigoted pattern was emerging, and that the bomber's motivations were solely political. But his undoing wouldn't come until after he'd successfully bombed yet another family planning clinic, this one in the neighboring state of Alabama, and this time he'd make it personal to law enforcement. You see, despite being so active in his new bomb-making hobby, the bomber hadn't actually killed anyone. Sure, he'd injured people and caused an awful lot of distress, but he'd never actually taken a life before. That all changed with the bombing of the family planning clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, because an off-duty police officer named Robert Sanderson happened to be present, and tragically, Officer Sanderson lost his life protecting the clinic whilst in uniform in his spare time. In addition, one of the clinic's nurses, a woman named Emily Lyons, received life-changing injuries as a result of the blast. One eye was destroyed and the other damaged. Her hand was mangled. A hole was torn into her abdomen that necessitated the removal of 10 inches of her intestines, and most of the flesh was blown off of her legs and hands. She was badly burned, her leg was shattered, and shrapnel had become permanently buried in her body. Emily spent 8 weeks in the hospital recuperating from her wounds, and has had over 20 surgeries to try to alleviate the long-term effects of her wounds. But even after years after the blast, she continued using a wheelchair and had poor hearing and eyesight. The law enforcement community had always taken the bomber seriously, but this time, one of their own had been killed, and a woman's life had been irreparably changed. They had to act, and they had to act fast. Following the bombings of the Alabama Family Planning Clinic, the FBI was approached by 2 men, Jeffrey Tickle and Jermaine Hughes. Each man claimed they had witnessed a rather suspicious-looking man who appeared to be fleeing the scene when others were rushing towards it. Tickle and Hughes had also made a note of this person's license plate and swiftly provided it to the FBI in the hopes they might bring the perpetrator to justice. Then, in October of 1998, the FBI named a suspect they believed to be responsible for all 3 of the recent bombings, including the bombing of the Centennial Olympic Park the previous year, Eric Robert Rudolph. Born on September 19th of 1966, Eric Rudolph and his family moved to Macon County, North Carolina after the untimely death of his father. By the time Eric was 18, he was spending time with his mother at a Christian identity compound in Missouri known as the Church of Israel, and after receiving his graduate equivalency degree, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, although he was discharged 4 years into his service for smoking cannabis. But it's this military service that could account for Rudolph's potential bomb-making expertise, as well as the determination and discipline it would take to execute 3 bombings with no material or logistical support from other people. With this information at hand, the FBI released a statement discouraging the public from approaching Rudolph, as he was considered armed and extremely dangerous. Instead, they offered a $1 million reward for any information leading to his capture, prompting him to go on the run. Rudolph's family were extremely vocal in their support of him, claiming he was completely innocent of all charges. This prompted the FBI to conduct multiple interviews with them, believing they knew of his whereabouts and were regularly in touch with him. As a result, authorities placed them under regular surveillance and routinely subjected them to lengthy interrogations designed to wear them down until they surrendered Rudolph's location. The FBI believed Rudolph to be hiding out somewhere in the hills of Appalachia, using his military survival skills to evade the numerous federal search teams which scoured the area. But they had little success, so time and time again, the FBI would return to the Rudolph family in a campaign which they labeled as state harassment. This harassment was apparently so intense that it prompted Daniel Rudolph, Eric's older brother, to send a videotape to the FBI, as well as various other media outlets. In it, he records himself sawing his own left hand off with a radial arm saw in order to, as he phrased it, send a message to the FBI and the media. His hand was later reattached by surgeons, but by that time, the message had been received loud and clear. His family would rather die than give their beloved Eric up to a government they didn't trust. Despite their efforts, it took almost 6 years for federal authorities to find and arrest Eric Rudolph, who had been hiding out in the exact same area they had suspected, the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina, just a stone's throw from where he grew up. He had survived for the better part of half a decade by gathering acorns and salamanders, pilfering vegetables from gardens, stealing grain from a grain silo, and raiding dumpsters in Murphy, a small nearby town of just over 1,500 people. But on May 31st of 2003, Rookie police officer Jeffrey Postle of the Murphy Police Department spotted a man rooting through a dumpster of a Save-A-Lot store in the early hours of the morning. Thinking he was dealing with a burglary suspect, Postle approached to confront the man and ask what he was doing. But when the man looked up, Postle's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the trimmed mustache, and the man's camouflage jacket gave him a distinctly military bearing. It was then he realized that he was looking at none other than the man who had been on the run from the FBI for 6 long years, Eric Robert Rudolph. As Postle drew his sidearm and ordered the fugitive to show his hands, Rudolph put up no resistance. He knew the game was up. While in custody, the police were horrified to hear that Rudolph still had a 250-pound stash of dynamite hidden somewhere in the hills nearby. In exchange for the federal government dropping the pursuit of the death penalty, Rudolph showed them where the explosives were hidden. Rudolph then released a series of statements from his jail cell, confirming that the bombings were anti-abortion and homophobic terrorism. He also claimed that he'd deprived the government of its goal of sentencing him to death. He also wrote, "The fact that I have entered an agreement with the government is purely a tactical choice on my part, and in no way legitimizes the moral authority of the government to judge this matter or impute my guilt." The Washington Post asserted that Rudolph had committed the bombings in support of the Christian identity movement, which asserts that those of Northern European ancestry are the direct descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. In other words, they're God's chosen people. In the same article, the Post also reported that Rudolph had claimed responsibility for the bombings on behalf of the Army of God, a group that sanctions the use of force to prevent abortions. Rudolph firmly denied being a member of any radical evangelical movement, stating, "I was born a Catholic, and with forgiveness I hope to die one." But he continued to use several Bible verses to justify his militant opposition to abortion, and relished the praise his actions prompted from several far-right Christian groups. "As I go to a prison cell for a lifetime," he said in a letter to his mother, "I know that I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith." On January 18, 2005, Eric Rudolph was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole for the 1998 murder of Officer Robert Sanderson. He was also sentenced for the 2 bombings in Atlanta, receiving 2 consecutive life terms before being transported to the ADX Florence Supermax Federal Prison in Colorado. Rudolph continued to release statements from his prison cell, including this comprehensive explanation for the Olympic Park bombing, some of which reads as follows. In the summer of 1996, the world converged upon Atlanta for the Olympic Games to celebrate the ideals of global socialism. Multinational corporations spent billions of dollars, and Washington organized an army of security to protect these best-of-all games. But the conception and the purpose of the so-called Olympic movement is to promote the values of global socialism, as perfectly expressed in the song Imagine by John Lennon, which was the theme of the 1996 Games. The purpose of the attack on July 27th was to confound, anger, and embarrass the Washington government in the eyes of the world for its abominable sanctioning of abortion on demand. The plan was to force the cancellation of the Games, or at least create a state of insecurity in order to empty the streets around the venues and thereby eat into the vast amounts of money that had been invested in them. But as the United States has shown time and time again, terrorism did not curtail the pride, happiness, or the basic freedoms of its citizens. America stood unbowed in the face of religious extremism, a positive that would prove chillingly prophetic over the years that followed. And with a grim reassurance, we stoically remind ourselves that those who wish to change our society with bloodshed, fear, and death will never be successful. Justice will always prevail, and the ideals of tolerance, freedom, and above all, love, will always triumph over evil. On Halloween night of 2005, 80-year-old World War II veteran and former building contractor Charlie Newman was settling into his evening routine at his home at 3025 Sun Lake Boulevard, Limestone County, Alabama. Charlie was a kind, religious man who lived alone, but was often visited by friends and relatives who assisted him in his twilight years. Yet Charlie had found himself clashing with an increasingly moody and rebellious grandson who had an apparent disdain for his grandfather's clean-cut Christian way of life. This grandson was also something of a spoiled brat and held a great deal of contempt for a man he believed should be a little more generous with his high finances. Charlie knew better than to just give him any cash, as he'd no doubt spend it on things he shouldn't. Yet little did he know that this very same grandson had hatched a plan to get some money out of Charlie, the method of which would prove disgustingly devious. Because at around 7:34, a young man in dark clothing was making his way towards Charlie's home, and he did so armed with an 8-inch combat knife and stun gun. Charlie was old, but for an octogenarian combat veteran, his hearing was surprisingly intact. So when this black-clad intruder managed to break into the house, Charlie confronted them with a handgun he kept hanging from a pair of deer antlers. But in doing so, Charlie realized he'd recognized the home invader, as the young man was none other than a close friend of his rebellious grandson's. Prior to the confrontation beginning, Charlie had the good sense to call 911 before leaving the phone off the hook, thus allowing the dispatcher to listen in on what went down. According to the same dispatcher, they heard Charlie saying things like, "What do you want? Don't do that, and leave me alone." Charlie also invited the home invader to sit and pray with him, but his grandson's friend ignored the invitation, repeatedly asking, "Where's the vault?" It's clear that Charlie Newman made numerous and repeated attempts to calm his potential attacker, explaining that there was no vault, and that the only safe in the home was one he kept his firearms in. But this only enraged the home invader, who was convinced that Charlie was lying to him. In fact, the only person that had lied was Charlie's grandson, who had actually planned the prospective robbery in tandem with his knife-wielding friend. He claimed his grandfather had a safe or vault, one that was stuffed with cash, bonds, and gold bars, the latter of which he apparently recovered from a Nazi gold vault during his wartime service. The idea was that they'd split whatever the friend could rob. But Charlie's grandson had no idea his old veteran grandfather would put up so much of a fight. Because when the invader brandished the knife in his hand and threatened to stab Charlie if he didn't reveal the location of his hidden wealth, Charlie gave him one last warning, then raised his handgun and pulled the trigger. Obviously, Charlie was well aware of the imminent threat to his safety, having been confronted in his own home by an armed robber. But even so, Charlie didn't want to kill the boy, just scare him. So the well-aimed shot from his handgun ripped through the fleshy part of the invader's shoulder, disabling his use of the stun gun, but not the knife. This only sent the home invader into a rage, and as he lunged at Charlie, bleeding from the fresh gunshot wound, he inflicted the first of over 50 stab wounds on the brave old veteran. In the process, he was able to grab Charlie's gun, and to finish him off, the invader shot him once in the chest. After that, Charlie breathed his final breath, and slipped away from a world he had given almost everything to protect. Following the 911 call Charlie made prior to his murder, Detective Katrina Flanagan was dispatched to Newman's house to investigate. When her knocks went unanswered, Flanagan went to the rear of the residence and noticed that although the glass storm door was closed, the wooden back door was open. Not only that, but that there was blood on the storm door. Another uniformed officer then told Flanagan that he could see a body inside the house, and after kicking in the back door with guns drawn, they found Charlie Newman's body lying in a pool of his own blood. He had suffered a combination of 54 stab wounds and lacerations to his head, including stab wounds to both eyes, 7 cuts to his neck, and a broken nose. It was evident he had also sustained a gunshot wound, the entrance wound being on the right side of his chest, and the exit wound was on the left side of his chest. A forensic pathologist would later testify that the exit wound was surrounded by purple discoloration, indicating that Charlie was against a hard object, such as the floor, when he was shot. Additionally, the entrance wound was surrounded by gunpowder, indicating that the pistol was at a close range when fired. However, it was determined that Charlie had died as a result of numerous sharp and blunt force injuries of the head and neck, and that he was likely dead prior to being shot. Flanagan then noticed blood shoe prints leading to the back door from the body and could smell the scent of gunpowder, meaning their shooter had only just departed the scene of the crime. Later that night, police officers William Watson, Bobby McAuliffe, and Clayton Jordan of the Madison Police Department responded to a call coming from a Chevron gasoline station. It was from a young man who claimed to have been shot, but when asked how and by who, he simply responded, "I have no idea. I don't know anything, I just know that I've been shot." When the cops arrived, the young man gave his name as Andrew Lakey, a 22-year-old eBay trader, but was otherwise completely uncooperative when it came to both how he'd been shot and how he ended up at the gas station to begin with. Officer William Watson then spotted a white Nissan Altima parked in front of the gas station, its white paint job making the bloodstains on it even more obvious. On closer inspection, the cops found blood on the steering wheel and front dash, what appeared to be an insulated pizza bag and a radio scanner in the front passenger seat, 2 pistols in the front passenger floorboard, and a bloody knife with a broken tip in the rear floorboard. Sergeant Jordan telephoned sheriff's department and police stations in neighboring counties to determine if there had been any reported shootings that evening, only to discover that indeed there had been. Andrew Lakey was then taken to the nearby Huntsville hospital to have his gunshot wound treated, but officers remained on standby to take him into custody upon his discharge. During a subsequent investigation, it was confirmed that Lakey was a close friend of Charlie's grandson, Derek. Derek himself testified at Lakey's murder trial, confirming he had told Andrew of his grandfather's wealth, as well as a supposed vault that could be accessed by a door next to the stairwell. Not only that, but Derek claimed that he and Lakey had been to a Long John Silver's restaurant 2 days before his grandfather's murder, where they had hashed out plans to loot his savings and split the take. According to Derek, Lakey ordered a chicken sandwich with a side of chili cheese fries. Then lo and behold, on a search of Andrew's bedroom, police found a Long John Silver's receipt which corroborated Derek's version of events. That, along with numerous other pieces of material evidence, tied Andrew Lakey to the shooting in a way that was irrefutable. He was charged with capital murder during a robbery, meaning a guilty verdict would result in him being handed the death penalty. Lakey's attorneys argued that he had a mild form of autism, but the prosecution insisted this implied nothing more than a slight social awkwardness, and that Lakey showed no signs of any serious mental disorder. Then on March 3rd of 2008, a 7-woman, 5-man jury unanimously convicted Lakey of Charlie Newman's murder, then recommended that Lakey be given the death penalty for a killing that was called heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Both of Lakey's parents made impassioned pleas for their son's life, but the sentencing judge noted that he found the murderer to be sane and aware of right and wrong, thus upholding the death sentence. 5 years later, on July 25th of 2013, Andrew Lakey was executed by lethal injection. His execution was scheduled after he wrote a letter to the Alabama Supreme Court in October saying that he had an odd request. "Please set me an execution date," he wrote. "I do not wish to pursue any further appeals for my death sentence." His last meal came from the prison kitchen and included grilled cheese and bologna sandwiches with French fries, and in the final week of his life, he was permitted to receive a visit from his mother. On the day of his execution, Andrew Lakey was wearing glasses and had trimmed dark hair and was already strapped to a gurney when a curtain opened at 6 p.m. to allow witnesses to see him. He looked around briefly, then laid his head on the pillow. The execution order was read before the prison's warden asked Lakey if he had anything to say. "No, sir, I don't," was all he replied. His mother, father, brother, and aunt all watched the execution in silence, his mother and father holding hands while an unnamed man and 2 women witnessed the execution on behalf of the victim's loved ones. Shortly after Lakey declined to make a statement, Chaplain Chris Summers approached the gurney, touched Lakey's hand, and spoke to him. Lakey nodded before Summers knelt to pray at his side and the execution began. The lethal cocktail of drugs seemed to take effect within just a couple of minutes after being administered, and the condemned man's torso convulsed slightly during the several minutes that followed. Yet soon, Lakey began to grow still, and after a few shallow breaths, he passed away at exactly 6:15 p.m. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, cats will steal your breath if you drink milk.